The morning mist hung heavy over Manila Bay on the 1st of May. 1898, as Commodore George Dewey stood aboard the bridge of his flagship, the USS Olympia. The 60-year-old naval commander adjusted his weathered cap and gazed through the dim light toward the Spanish fleet anchored in the shallow waters near Cavite. Behind him, 5 other American warships cut through the calm waters in perfect formation: the USS Baltimore, USS Raleigh, USS Petrel, USS Concord, and USS Boston. The moment that would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific was at hand. Dewey had sailed from Hong Kong just 6 days earlier, his squadron loaded with ammunition and burning with purpose. The Spanish-American War had erupted following the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor 2 months prior, and now the conflict had spread across the globe to this distant corner of the Spanish Empire. The Philippines, Spain's jewel in the Pacific, represented centuries of colonial dominance that was about to be tested by American steel and determination. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the tropical atmosphere, the Spanish fleet became clearly visible. Admiral Patricio Montoyo. Why Passeron had positioned his ships the flagship Reina Cristina, Castilla Don Antonio de Ulloa, Don Juan de Austria, Isla de Luzon, Isla de Cuba, Can Marks, Del Duaran. What he believed was a defensive formation. Near the Cavite Naval Yard, the Spanish commander had made a fateful decision to anchor his vessels in shallow water, hoping that if his ships were sunk, his crews could wade to shore. This tactical choice would prove disastrous. The tension aboard the American vessels was palpable. Sailors checked their weapons one final time, while gunners prepared their artillery for the coming engagement. Many of these men had never seen combat, yet they carried themselves with the confidence that came from superior training and modern equipment. The USS Olympia alone mounted for 8 Tinch guns and 10 5-inch rapid-fire cannons, representing the cutting edge of naval technology. According to contemporary accounts from Harper's Weekly, the American squadron had spent months preparing for this moment, conducting intensive gunnery practice and studying Spanish naval tactics. The crew's discipline would soon be tested against an enemy fighting desperately to preserve for centuries of imperial legacy in the East. At 5:39 in the morning, as the distance between the fleets closed to approximately 5,000 yards, Commodore Dewey turned to Captain Charles Vernon Gridley, commander of the Olympia, and uttered the words that would echo through naval history. "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley." The captain nodded grimly and relayed the order. To his gun crews, the first American salvo erupted from the Olympia's forward turrets, sending 8-inch shells screaming across the morning air toward the Spanish line. The thunderous roar rolled across the bay like an earthquake, shattering the tropical calm and announcing to the world that a new chapter in naval warfare had begun. Within seconds, the other American ships joined the bombardment, their guns flashing in rapid succession as they unleashed a coordinated assault on the Spanish fleet. The Spanish ships responded immediately, their older cannons barking defiantly. As they attempted to return fire, Admiral Montoyo, aboard the Reina Cristina, ordered his flagship to advance bravely toward the American line. Hoping to close the distance and bring his smaller guns into effective range, black smoke began to pour from both fleets as the battle commenced in earnest, marking the beginning of what would become one of the most decisive naval engagements in American history. The USS Olympia led the American battle line in a deadly elliptical pattern, her guns thundering with mechanical precision as she circled the trapped Spanish fleet. Commodore Dewey had devised a brilliant tactical maneuver. Rather than engaging in a static gun duel, his ships would maintain constant motion, making themselves difficult targets while keeping their opponents within killing range. The American vessels moved in perfect coordination, each ship maintaining its position in the deadly dance that was slowly dismantling Spanish naval power in the Pacific. Aboard the Spanish flagship Reina Cristina, Admiral Montoyo watched in growing horror as American shells found their mark with devastating accuracy. The difference in gunnery between the two fleets became apparent within the first hour of combat. American gunners, trained extensively in long-range precision shooting, consistently struck their targets, while Spanish return fire fell harmlessly into the bay or whistled overhead. The technological gap between the fleets was becoming tragically evident. The USS Baltimore, second in the American line, concentrated her fire on the Spanish cruiser Castilla, which had been deliberately grounded to serve as a floating battery. Captain Nehemiah Mayo Dyer directed his gunners with calm efficiency, watching as their shells tore through the Spanish vessel's wooden hull and antiquated armor. The Castilla's crew fought valiantly, but their ship had been designed for an earlier era of naval warfare and stood little chance against modern American ordnance. Meanwhile, the smaller American vessels, the USS Petrel, USS Concord, and USS Boston, engaged the Spanish gunboats and smaller warships with devastating effect. The rapid-fire guns mounted on these ships proved particularly deadly, sending streams of shells into the Spanish vessels faster than their crews could respond. The USS Raleigh, bringing up the rear of the American formation, added her firepower to the systematic destruction of Spanish naval might, as reported in the New York World's detailed coverage of the engagement. The Spanish crews displayed remarkable courage, despite their hopeless situation. The crew of the Don Antonio de Ulloa continued firing even as their ship began to list heavily from multiple hits below the waterline. Spanish sailors could be seen working frantically to plug holes and maintain their guns in action, displaying the kind of desperate heroism that marks the final moments of a doomed cause. By 7 in the morning, after nearly an hour and a half of continuous bombardment, Commodore Dewey made a surprising decision that would add to the legend of Manila Bay. Receiving reports from his ships about ammunition consumption, he ordered a temporary ceasefire to allow his crews to have breakfast and redistribute ordnance. This calculated pause demonstrated the complete confidence the American commander had in his tactical position. He could afford to break for a meal, while his enemy burned and bled. The Spanish fleet used this respite to attempt emergency repairs and evacuate their wounded. Admiral Montoyo, aboard the heavily damaged Reina Cristina, surveyed the catastrophic scene around him. Several of his ships were already sinking or burning beyond salvation, while others had suffered such severe damage that they could barely maintain their positions. The shallow water that he had chosen for protection was now becoming a trap, preventing his damaged vessels from seeking safety in deeper waters. During this lull in the fighting, both sides assessed the situation. For the Americans, the battle was proceeding exactly as planned. Their superior gunnery and tactical mobility were systematically destroying Spanish resistance without suffering significant casualties. For the Spanish, the harsh reality of their situation was becoming undeniable. For centuries of naval tradition were being swept away in a single morning by an upstart American fleet that represented the future of naval warfare. When the U.S. Olympia's guns resumed their deadly work at 11:15 in the morning, the sound marked not just the continuation of a battle, but the death knell of Spanish power in the Pacific. Commodore Dewey had spent the 2-hour breakfast intermission carefully repositioning his squadron, bringing his ships even closer to the beleaguered Spanish fleet. The range had now closed to a mere 2,000 yards, ensuring that every American shell would find its mark with devastating precision. The Spanish flagship Reina Cristina, already heavily damaged from the morning's bombardment, attempted one final desperate charge toward the American line. Admiral Montoyo, displaying the kind of suicidal courage that had characterized Spanish naval tradition for centuries, ordered his flagship to close the distance with the USS Olympia in a last bid to inflict significant damage on the American fleet. The aging cruiser, her hull punctured by dozens of shell holes and her superstructure twisted by explosion after explosion, limped forward through the smoke-filled bay. The sight of the Spanish flagship's final charge stirred something profound in the American crews. Here was an enemy displaying magnificent bravery in the face of certain destruction, and the Americans responded with a concentrated barrage that was both professionally efficient and strangely respectful. The USS Olympia's attention guns spoke in measured cadence, each shot carefully aimed to end the Spanish vessel's suffering as quickly as possible. The Reina Cristina managed to close to within 1,500 yards of the American line before the inevitable occurred. A direct hit from the Olympia's forward turret struck the Spanish flagship's magazine, and the resulting explosion lifted the entire forward section of the ship out of the water. When the smoke cleared, Admiral Montoyo's proud vessel was settling rapidly by the bow, her colors still flying defiantly, even as the Pacific waters claimed her. According to detailed accounts published in the Times of London, Admiral Montoyo himself was wounded during this final phase of the battle, but refused to abandon his flagship until the very last moment. Spanish sailors could be seen helping their wounded admiral into a small boat just before the Reina Cristina disappeared beneath the waves. Taking with her 400 years of Spanish naval supremacy in Asian waters, the destruction of the Spanish flagship effectively ended organized resistance. But several Spanish vessels continued to fight with individual determination. The Don Juan de Austria, commanded by Captain Luis Cadarso, maintained a steady fire against the USS Baltimore until a direct hit killed the captain and most of his bridge crew. The ship's first officer attempted to continue the fight, but with his vessel taking on water rapidly and most of his guns out of action, he finally ordered the Spanish colors struck. The USS Petrel and USS Concord, the smallest ships in Dewey's squadron, moved in to finish off the remaining Spanish gunboats and transports. These smaller American vessels, armed with rapid-fire guns, systematically destroyed what remained of Spanish naval power in Manila Bay. The Marques del Duero and Isla de Cuba were set ablaze by concentrated fire, while the Isla de Luzon was sunk by a torpedo from the USS Petrel. By noon, the transformation was complete. Where once a proud Spanish fleet had anchored in defensive formation, now only burning wrecks and oil slicks marked the spots where ships had fought and died. The bay itself seemed different. The smoke of battle had cleared to reveal an American squadron in perfect formation, virtually undamaged, riding at anchor in waters that now belonged to the United States of America. The speed and completeness of the American victory stunned observers around the world. In less than 7 hours, Commodore Dewey had not only destroyed an entire enemy fleet, but had effectively ended Spanish colonial power in the Pacific. The aftermath of the Battle of Manila Bay revealed the true scope of the American victory and the magnitude of the Spanish disaster. As the smoke cleared and the bay fell silent except for the cries of survivors in the water, the statistics of the engagement began to tell their stark story. The entire Spanish fleet, 11 vessels ranging from cruisers to gunboats, had been destroyed or captured. Not a single Spanish ship remained capable of offensive action, and most lay on the bottom of the bay or burned as smoking hulks. The human cost of the battle reflected the one-sided nature of the engagement. Spanish casualties numbered approximately 400 killed and wounded, including many officers who had died heroically at their posts. Among the Spanish dead was Captain Luis Cadarso of the Don Juan de Austria, who had refused to surrender his ship even when the situation became hopeless. Admiral Montoyo himself had been wounded but survived, though his career and his nation's Pacific Empire had both ended in the span of a single morning. In stark contrast, American casualties were almost negligible, a fact that would be reported with amazement in newspapers around the world. Only 8 American sailors had been wounded during the entire engagement, and remarkably, not a single American had been killed. This disparity in casualties highlighted not only the technological superiority of the American fleet, but also the tactical brilliance of Commodore Dewey's battle plan. The USS Olympia herself had been struck by Spanish shells several times but suffered no significant damage. One shell had passed completely through the ship's hull without exploding, while another had damaged some rigging without affecting the vessel's fighting capability. The other American ships had fared even better, with most suffering only superficial damage from Spanish gunfire. The American squadron remained completely intact and ready for further action. As documented in Harper's Magazine's comprehensive analysis of the battle, the engagement demonstrated the evolution of naval warfare from the wooden ship era to the age of steel and precision gunnery. The Spanish fleet, composed largely of vessels designed for earlier forms of naval combat, had been hopelessly outmatched by American ships that represented the latest advances in naval architecture and armament. The victory at Manila Bay had immediate strategic consequences that extended far beyond the Philippines. News of Dewey's triumph, transmitted around the world via undersea telegraph cables, fundamentally altered the global perception of American naval power. European naval experts, who had generally dismissed the American Navy as a coastal defense force, were forced to reassess their assumptions about the new nation's military capabilities. Commodore Dewey found himself in an unusual position following the battle. While he had destroyed the Spanish fleet, he lacked the ground forces necessary to capture Manila itself. The city remained under Spanish control, defended by approximately 13,000 troops under General Basilio Agustin y Davila. Dewey's ships controlled the harbor and could bombard the city at will. But taking and holding territory required soldiers, not sailors. This limitation led to one of the most interesting aspects of the post-battle situation. For several months, Dewey's fleet would remain in Manila Bay, effectively blockading the Spanish garrison while awaiting the arrival of American ground forces. During this period, the Commodore would become involved in complex negotiations, not only with the Spanish authorities, but also with Filipino revolutionary leader Emilio Aguinaldo, who had been fighting for independence from Spanish rule. The battle's impact on Spanish morale throughout their remaining Pacific territories was devastating. Word of the fleet's destruction spread quickly to other Spanish colonial possessions, undermining confidence in Spain's ability to defend its empire. The psychological effect of the defeat was perhaps even more significant than the immediate military consequences. The destruction of the Spanish Pacific Fleet at Manila Bay sent shockwaves across the globe that would reshape international relations for decades to come. Within hours of the battle's conclusion, Commodore Dewey dispatched the USS McCulloch to Hong Kong with news of his complete victory. The telegraph cables that carried this information to Washington and then around the world sparked celebrations in American cities and serious strategic reassessments in European capitals. President William McKinley received word of the victory. While at the White House on the 2nd of May, 1898, the president, who had initially been reluctant to expand American involvement in the Philippines beyond a simple naval demonstration, now found himself confronting the reality that his nation had suddenly acquired responsibility for millions of Filipino subjects and strategic control over one of Asia's most important harbors. The international reaction to Dewey's victory revealed the complex web of colonial interests that dominated Pacific politics at the end of the 19th century. Great Britain, despite its rivalry with the United States in other spheres, viewed the American victory favorably as it weakened Spanish power while potentially opening new markets for British trade. Germany, however, saw the American success as a threat to its own Pacific ambitions and immediately began positioning naval forces in Philippine waters. According to detailed coverage in the London Times, European naval experts were forced to completely revise their assessments of American military capabilities. The Royal Navy, which had long considered itself the world's dominant naval force, began studying American gunnery techniques and ship design with new respect. The precision and effectiveness of American naval gunfire at Manila Bay had demonstrated that the United States possessed not just modern ships, but also the training and tactical expertise to use them effectively. The victory also had profound implications for American domestic politics. The Democratic Party, which had been critical of the war effort, found itself struggling to oppose a conflict that had produced such spectacular results at such minimal cost. Republican politicians seized upon Dewey's triumph as validation of their expansionist policies, arguing that the United States had a duty to civilize and uplift the peoples of the former Spanish territories. Commodore Dewey himself became an overnight sensation in American popular culture. His calm demeanor during the battle and his famous order to fire when ready gridly captured the public imagination. Songs were written about the battle, children played games reenacting the engagement, and Dewey's photograph appeared on everything from postcards to tobacco advertisements. The Commodore had become America's first modern military celebrity. However, the victory also created new challenges that the McKinley administration had not anticipated. The Philippines contained over 7 million inhabitants, speaking dozens of different languages and representing numerous ethnic groups. Spanish colonial administration, while often harsh, had at least provided a framework for governing this diverse population. Now the United States found itself responsible for maintaining order and providing governed services across thousands of islands. The Filipino independence movement, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, initially welcomed the American victory as liberation. From Spanish rule, Aguinaldo had been in exile in Hong Kong when the war began. A return to the Philippines aboard an American ship following Dewey's triumph. The revolutionary leader expected that the United States would recognize Filipino independence, just as it had promised to respect Cuban sovereignty. These expectations would soon lead to conflict as it became clear that the United States intended to retain control over the Philippines rather than granting immediate independence. The same harbor where Dewey had won his spectacular victory would later witness the beginning of a brutal guerrilla war between American forces and Filipino independence. A conflict that would last for years and cost thousands of lives. On both sides, the weeks following the Battle of Manila Bay revealed the complex challenges that accompanied America's swift naval victory. While Commodore Dewey's fleet controlled the harbor and could dictate terms to Spanish naval forces, the Commodore found himself in the awkward position of occupying enemy waters without sufficient troops to capture the city itself. Manila remained under Spanish military control, defended by Governor-General Basilio Agustin y Davila and approximately 13,000 Spanish soldiers who had witnessed their navy's destruction from the city's ancient walls. This unusual situation created a peculiar form of siege warfare. Dewey's ships dominated the bay and could bombard Manila at will. But the Commodore was reluctant to shell civilian areas without provocation. Instead, a tense standoff developed, Spanish forces controlling the land while American naval power commanded the sea. Supply ships attempting to reach Manila were intercepted by American vessels, gradually tightening the noose around the Spanish garrison. The international community watched these developments with fascination and concern. Several European powers, particularly Germany, began moving naval forces toward Philippine waters under the pretense of protecting their citizens and commercial interests. Kaiser Wilhelm II saw an opportunity to challenge American expansion in the Pacific, and German Admiral Otto von Dedericks arrived in Manila Bay with a squadron that eventually numbered 5 warships more vessels than Dewey commanded. The German presence created a dangerous diplomatic crisis that received extensive coverage in the European press. Von Dedericks consistently tested American authority, ignoring naval protocols and positioning his ships in ways that suggested potential intervention. According to reports in the Berliner Tageblatt, German officials were seriously considering supporting Spanish efforts to retain the Philippines. Viewing American expansion as a threat to German colonial ambitions in the Pacific, Commodore Dewey handled the German challenge with characteristic aplomb, making it clear that he considered Manila Bay to be under American control and would enforce American authority regardless of European opinions. The tension reached its peak when Dewey allegedly told the German admiral that he was prepared to engage any power that interfered with American operations. This firm stance, backed by the demonstrated effectiveness of American gunnery, eventually persuaded the Germans to adopt a less aggressive posture. Meanwhile, Spanish garrison in Manila faced increasingly desperate circumstances. Cut off from supply lines and reinforcements, Governor-General Agustin attempted to negotiate some form of honorable surrender that would preserve Spanish dignity while acknowledging military reality. These negotiations were complicated by the presence of Filipino revolutionary forces who had surrounded the city from the landward side and demanded a voice in any settlement. Emilio Aguinaldo's return to the Philippines had sparked a revival of the independence movement that Spanish forces had been fighting for years. Filipino insurgents, encouraged by the destruction of Spanish naval power, launched coordinated attacks on Spanish outposts throughout the archipelago. Within weeks of the naval battle, Spanish control had been reduced to Manila and a few other heavily fortified positions. The McKinley administration found itself managing a complex three-way negotiation involving Spanish authorities, Filipino revolutionaries, and American military commanders. Secretary of War Russell Alger worked feverishly to organize and transport ground forces to the Philippines. But the logistical challenges of projecting military power across the Pacific meant that Dewey would have to maintain his blockade for months before substantial reinforcements arrived. This period of waiting created an opportunity for reflection on the broader implications of American victory. The United States had entered the war with Spain, primarily over Cuban independence, but the destruction of the Spanish Pacific Fleet had suddenly made America a colonial power in Asia. The nation that had been founded on principles of self-determination now found itself ruling over millions of subjects who had never consented to American governance. The irony of this situation was not lost on contemporary observers, particularly in Europe, where colonial powers watched with interest to see how American democratic ideals would adapt to imperial realities. The final act of the Manila Bay drama began on the 13th of August, 1898, when American ground forces under General Wesley Merritt finally arrived in sufficient numbers to assault the city. The intervening months had transformed the strategic situation throughout the Philippines, with Spanish control reduced to a few isolated strongholds. While Filipino revolutionary forces controlled much of the countryside, the moment had come to complete what Commodore Dewey's guns had begun in the early morning hours of that fateful May day. The assault on Manila proved to be largely ceremonial. Governor-General Fermin Yodins Y. Alvarez, who had replaced the earlier Spanish commander, had already entered into secret negotiations with General Merritt to arrange a face-saving surrender. Spanish honor required that they resist American attacks, but both sides understood that meaningful resistance was impossible given the overwhelming American advantage in men and materiel. The mock battle that followed allowed Spanish forces to demonstrate their courage while avoiding unnecessary casualties. Spanish soldiers fired into the air while American forces advanced methodically through the city's outer defenses. By afternoon, Spanish colors were lowered from the ancient fortress walls, and the stars and stripes rose over Manila for the first time. For centuries of Spanish rule in the Philippines had come to an end, replaced by American administration that would prove to be both transformative and controversial. The formal end of the Spanish-American War came with the Treaty of Paris. Signed on the 10th of December, 1898, Spain ceded the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico to the United States, while relinquishing all claims to Cuba. The United States agreed to pay Spain $20 million for the Philippines, though this compensation seemed almost insulting given the vast wealth and strategic value of the archipelago. The treaty negotiations revealed the full scope of the transformation that had begun with Dewey's victory at Manila Bay. The United States had entered the war as a continental power with limited overseas interests. The nation emerged from the conflict as a global empire with responsibilities spanning to oceans and millions of new subjects. The speed of this transformation astonished observers both at home and abroad. However, the most tragic consequence of American victory was yet to come. Filipino leaders who had expected independence following Spanish defeat were devastated to learn that the United States intended to retain control over their homeland. Emilio Aguinaldo, who had initially welcomed American forces as liberators, now found himself leading a new war for independence, this time against his former allies. The Philippine-American War that followed would prove far more costly and brutal than the brief conflict with Spain. American forces, who had won quick victory through superior technology and tactics, now faced a guerrilla conflict that would drag on for years and claim thousands of lives on both sides. The same harbors where Dewey had won his bloodless triumph would witness the arrival of ships carrying reinforcements for a grinding counterinsurgency campaign, as documented extensively in the Atlantic Monthly's retrospective coverage. The Battle of Manila Bay marked a fundamental turning point in world history. The engagement demonstrated that naval warfare had entered a new era where technological superiority and professional training could overcome traditional advantages of position and numbers. More importantly, the battle announced the emergence of the United States as a major Pacific power capable of projecting military force across vast ocean distances. Commodore Dewey returned to the United States as a national hero. He was promoted to admiral and celebrated with parades in major cities. His victory had cost American taxpayers approximately $600 in ammunition while destroying an entire enemy fleet and acquiring an empire. From a purely military perspective, the Battle of Manila Bay represented one of the most cost-effective victories in naval history, yet the true legacy of that May morning in 1898 extends far beyond tactical innovations or territorial acquisitions. The thunder of Dewey's guns at Manila Bay announced the dawn of the American century, marking the moment when the United States stepped onto the world stage as a global power. The Pacific Ocean, which had been a Spanish lake for centuries, became an American CIA transformation that would shape international relations throughout the 20th century and beyond. The battle that began with Commodore Dewey's calm order to fire when ready had unleashed forces that would ultimately reshape the entire Pacific region, establishing the United States as the dominant naval power in waters that stretch from California to the Philippines, and setting in motion the events that would define America's role in the modern world.